It is the autumn of 1854, and war is raging on the Crimean Peninsula between Tsarist Russia and the Ottoman Empire, which is supported militarily by France, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and Great Britain. The death toll is rising every day, and the British newspapers are filled with articles about the terrible conditions awaiting wounded soldiers in the field hospitals. People are lamenting the situation, politicians are taking advice, but it is hospital nurse Florence Nightingale who is coming up with the real solution. She proposes the creation of a women's health field service to get impoverished British soldiers back on their feet. So, in October, she and a group of 38 other nurses leave for the town of Scutari. There are 10 times more men dying in the hospital than at the front. Florence Nightingale was born in May 1820, while her parents were traveling in Italy. They chose her name from the city in which she was born, Florence. She had a nice childhood. Her family belonged to the British elite, and from an early age she was getting used to it. And since it was not customary for girls to go to university in Victorian times, she spent long hours with her father, who taught her foreign languages, philosophy, or mathematics. Everything changed in February 1837, when Florence was allegedly first approached by God. From then on, she said, she knew she wanted to dedicate her life to helping others. All she had to do was figure out how. 7 long years later, she finally plucks up the courage to put her plan into action. She rejects her longtime suitor, the politician and poet Richard Monckton Milnes, and tells her parents that married life and child-rearing is not for her, and that she will spend the next few years traveling in foreign countries to learn nursing. Although the family disagrees with Florence's decision, they do not turn their backs on her. Her father will pay her a decent allowance for the next few years, and the 24-year-old will immerse herself in self-study. There are no schools for nurses at the time, and the only chance to gain experience is through practice. During her travels, Florence visits Egypt, Greece, and Italy. Then in Rome, she meets the politician Sidney Herbert, who is in town on his honeymoon. She befriends him and his wife, and she has no idea how crucial this meeting will one day be for her. In 1850, Florence moves to Germany, where she visits the Lutheran community in today's Düsseldorf. In a hospital run by Pastor Theodor Fliedner, she undergoes 4 months of training and helps the sick and the poor. This experience changes her life. Later, she moves to a hospital in Paris and finally returns to England in 1853. And she takes her big goals with her. In London, Florence gets the opportunity to work at the Institute for the Care of Sick Ladies, even as a manager. In just 1 year, she introduces a number of changes that, although they may seem trivial today, mean a major improvement in conditions for patients. Thanks to her alarm system, they can now summon a nurse from a corridor or get an elevator that brings food from the kitchen straight to the ward. Florence can also provide hot water or, unusual until then, separate patients by diagnosis. In 1853, news of the appalling conditions awaiting soldiers wounded in the Crimean War begins to leak into British newspapers. The British army fights on the side of the Ottomans in a conflict between Russia and the Turks. And Florence reads with concern reports describing how many times more soldiers die of infection in field hospitals than are killed on the front line. It is clear to her that unless sanitary conditions improve, the death toll will continue to rise steeply. And that's where Sidney Herbert, her influential friend, and now British Secretary of War, comes in. Florence proposes to him to set up a medical field service made up of female nurses, and Herbert approves her ambitious idea. And as expected, he appoints her to head the group. 39 nurses, mostly nuns, leave for Turkey in October 1854. What awaited the women in the infirmary, which was located in what is now the Scutari district of Istanbul, was, in a word, horrific. The wounded were cared for by exhausted staff. There were no sanitary measures in place. There was a lack of medicines, and the wounded were malnourished. However, the situation slowly began to improve. For example, Florence introduced compulsory hand washing, built toilets and laundry facilities, ensured that the sewers were cleaned, and improved the ventilation system. These seemingly small things worked miraculously. The mortality rate dropped from 42% to just 2%. There were fewer patients with cholera, dysentery, or typhus, and the germ breeding ground became a functioning hospital. But the nurses were doing much more than just making sure the dressings were clean, especially Florence. Perhaps her efforts are best summed up in an article that appeared in the Times during the war. In it, the author describes the selfless nurse as an angel who floats silently down the corridors. And while the doctors have gone to sleep, she goes around the sick with a lamp in her hand, making sure all are fine. When she returns home after the war, in 1856, she is seen by Britain as a war heroine. Everyone knows who Florence Nightingale is, the lady with the lamp who saved the lives of hundreds of wounded. We're moving to 1857. Now Florence herself is ill. She has been unwell since her return from Turkey, and we now know that the cause was probably the then unknown Crimean fever, a bacterial febrile illness that affects several organs at once. And as if that wasn't enough, at only 37 years old, he is also suffering from depression and rheumatic inflammation of the spine. She will be invalid for the rest of her life, and even permanently bedridden after her 75th birthday. But even all this does not stop her from thinking about how to take healthcare a step further. As early as November 1855, the so-called Nightingale Fund is established for the training of nurses. In a flood of solidarity, people begin to send her generous financial contributions, and at the end of the Crimean War, Florence has at her disposal an impressive £45,000. She decides to invest the money in the first-ever school for nurses. It will be inaugurated in July 1860 at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. 5 years later, England has its first graduate nurses. But Florence is also a mentor to a number of foreign nurses who come from all over the world to spread her knowledge. From America to Australia to Japan, there are more and more professional nurses around the world. Although she is still ill, thanks to her stubbornness and influential contacts, she manages great things from her bed. She writes books, perhaps most famously Notes on Nursing, which soon become required reading for every nurse. While her views are in many ways progressive, convincing often ossified officials of the need for change is not easy. But Florence is good at this too. Thanks to the knowledge of mathematics and logic instilled in her by her father, she is very persuasive in her arguments, often using practical examples and graphs. The visual representation of statistics, which is very unusual for that time, becomes the basis of her manuscript. Especially famous is the so-called Nightingale-Rose diagram, now known as the polar diagram, which is a combination of a radar and bar chart, and is well suited for visualizing data that exhibit some cyclicality. For example, she uses her diagrams in an 1863 publication on health and sanitation problems in the British colonial Corps in India, using a questionnaire survey of soldiers to create a visually compelling presentation of an unsatisfactory condition. This will go all the way to Queen Victoria herself, who will eventually approve the proposed sanitation reforms, and within a decade, soldier mortality in India will plummet. Throughout the 1870s, Florence continues to struggle with health problems and spends most of her time in her room writing, resulting in works such as Notes on Postpartum Period in a Hospital. Partial relief does not come until the 80s, but the chronic pain is eventually replaced by blindness. The loss of sight makes it impossible for Florence to continue working, and with the arrival of the 20th century, the final chapter of her life begins. When she dies peacefully in her sleep in 1910, at the venerable age of 90, no one doubts that she made the most of her life and the opportunities that fate and her times gave her. Florence Nightingale's unusual compassion, determination, and ability to see things through earned her many awards during her lifetime, including the Order of the British Empire, which she was the first woman in history to receive. Today, she is considered the founder of modern nursing, and many hospitals around the world bear her name. But most importantly, thanks to her, thousands of people who would otherwise have faced almost certain death were able to continue living their lives. And yet, at the beginning of it all, there was only one 17-year-old girl who decided to give up a life of luxury and dedicate it to helping others.